The prairie held its breath that morning. A young woman lay broken beneath a cottonwood tree. Her name was Elsie, and she was dying. Beside her, two small children sobbed, their tears lost in the endless grass. They were alone, abandoned, with nothing but the empty sky for a witness, until a rider appeared on the horizon, a man with a haunted past, a man who had sworn off other people's troubles. He only meant to ride by. He told himself it wasn't his fight, but he was wrong. This fight had been his for years, he just didn't know it yet. The man's name was Lorenzo, and the moment he pulled his horse to a stop, his life, and theirs, would never be the same. He saw the woman's bruised face, the terror in her children's eyes, and a ghost from his own past stirred in its grave. He had a choice: ride on and keep his solitude, or step into a world of trouble that could get them all killed. What he didn't know was that this woman held a secret powerful enough to bring a whole town to its knees, a secret her enemies would kill for, and a secret that was tangled up in the very tragedy that had driven Lorenzo into the mountains in the first place. The horse stood still, its breath pluming in the damp spring air. Lorenzo's shadow fell over the small, desperate family. The little girl, Ida, stood up, her tiny body a shield for her mother. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking but fierce, "Mama's hurt bad. Please, don't leave us." Lorenzo's hand tightened on the reins. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to ride away from the kind of pain he knew all too well. But he couldn't. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and walked toward them. The ranch house was a lonely shape against the vast sweep of the prairie. For years it had been a place of silence, a fortress Lorenzo had built to keep his ghosts locked inside. Now, as he carried Elsie through the door, the silence felt different. It felt like an accusation. He laid her on his own bed, the only one in the house, and covered her with a thick quilt. She was so light, she felt like a bird in his arms. Her children, Ida and Nat, huddled in the doorway, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. Lorenzo's hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he stoked the fire. He wasn't a man used to company. He wasn't a man used to caring. But as he looked at the two small faces watching him, something inside him broke. He saw his own son's face in the boys. He saw his wife's eyes in the girls. The ghosts he had tried so hard to bury were suddenly here, in his house, breathing his air. He worked on instinct, his movements rough but gentle. He heated water, cleaned Elsie's wounds, and spooned broth between her cracked lips. She was barely conscious, muttering fragments of words he couldn't understand. Ida never left her side, a tiny, fierce guardian. That first night, Lorenzo didn't sleep. He sat in a chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, and listened to them breathe. Every sigh, every whimper, was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his solitude. He had brought them here to save them. He was beginning to realize he had brought them here for another reason entirely. He had brought them here to save himself. But salvation, he knew, came with a price. The next morning, Elsie was awake. She watched him from the bed, her eyes clouded with suspicion. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Lorenzo didn't have an answer, not a real one. "You needed help," he said, his voice gruff. The town was a different kind of danger. When he rode in for supplies, the whispers followed him like flies. "He's taken in that stray, the one whose family threw her out." He ignored them, but the words were like burrs, sticking to his soul. Elsie's strength returned slowly. She began to move around the cabin, her presence filling the empty spaces. She swept the floor. She mended his shirts with neat, careful stitches. She baked bread that filled the house with a smell he hadn't known in years. They were small things, but they were everything. The children, too, began to thaw. Ida's suspicion turned to a cautious curiosity. Nat, the little boy, started following him, his small shadow trailing Lorenzo's large one. One afternoon, Nat found a small, carved wooden horse on a high shelf. He brought it to Lorenzo, his eyes full of a silent question. Lorenzo took it, his hand trembling. He had carved it for his own son, a lifetime ago. He had forgotten it was even there. He looked at Nat, at the innocent hope in the boy's face, and handed it to him. "He's yours now," Lorenzo said, his voice thick. That night, after the children were asleep, a rider came. He brought a letter, sealed with the wax crest of Elsie's in-laws. Her hands shook as she read it. Their words were daggers. They called her unfit, a disgrace. They were coming to take the children. The letter fell from her hands. Lorenzo picked it up. His face was a mask of cold fury as he read the threats. "They can't," Elsie sobbed. "They won't." Lorenzo looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes. He knew what a fight like this could do. He knew the power of a wealthy family against a lone woman. But as he looked at her, and at the sleeping forms of her children, he made a choice. "This is my land," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one takes a child from this land against my will." The promise hung in the air between them, a fragile, dangerous thing. Elsie looked at him, her eyes wide with a hope she was terrified to feel. But the letter wasn't just a threat. It was a clue. Tucked inside the main page was a smaller, folded note. The handwriting was different, hurried. It spoke of a debt, a secret meeting, and a name that made Lorenzo's blood run cold. It was the name of the man responsible for the mine collapse that had killed his own wife and son. This wasn't just about Elsie's children. It was about his past. The ghosts he had been running from had just found him, and they had come for a reckoning. The name on the secret note was Jasper Thorne, the man who owned the mine, the town, and every soul in it. The man whose greed had cost Lorenzo everything. And now, somehow, Elsie was tangled in his web. "This man, Thorne," Lorenzo said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What do you know of him?" Elsie's face was pale in the lamplight. "My husband. He worked for him. In the land office. He handled Thorne's accounts." Her eyes widened with a dawning horror. "He was always so worried. He'd work late, poring over ledgers. He said Thorne was a cheat, that he was stealing from the miners, from the railroad." The pieces clicked into place. Elsie's in-laws weren't just cruel. They were puppets. Thorne was pulling the strings. He didn't want the children. He wanted something Elsie's husband had left behind. Proof of his crimes. "They think you have his ledgers," Lorenzo said. "The ones that prove what a snake he is." "I don't," she whispered. "They took everything when they threw us out." But the in-laws arrived the next day, their faces hard with a false righteousness. They weren't alone. The town sheriff was with them, his badge a tarnished symbol of a law that had already been bought and paid for. "We've come for the children," Elsie's brother-in-law announced. Lorenzo stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "They're not going anywhere." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Now, Lorenzo, this is a family matter. The law is on their side." "The law?" Lorenzo's laugh was a bitter, ugly sound. "The law in this valley is whatever Jasper Thorne says it is." The sheriff's face reddened. The in-laws sputtered with indignation. But before the confrontation could escalate, Elsie stepped forward. She stood beside Lorenzo, her small frame dwarfed by his, but her voice was clear and strong. "These children are mine. And this is our home. You will not take them." The raw courage of her words stunned them all into silence. They had expected a broken, weeping woman. They found a lioness. They left, spitting threats. But they left, for now. That night, as the children slept, Elsie and Lorenzo sat by the fire, the air thick with unspoken truths. "They'll be back," Elsie said, "with Thorne's men this time." "I know." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "Why are you doing this, risking everything for us?" He looked at her, at the strength he had seen in her, a strength that mirrored the one he had lost in his own wife. "Because Thorne took my family," he said, his voice raw with a grief he had never shared with anyone. "I won't let him take yours." The confession hung between them, a bridge built of shared pain. He told her about the mine collapse, about the cheap timbers, about the wife and son he had pulled from the wreckage with his own 2 hands. As he spoke, Elsie's eyes filled with tears. Not of pity, but of a fierce, protective anger. My husband. He tried to warn them. He had the proof. The ledgers. He was going to take them to the authorities. Lorenzo's head snapped up. Where are they now? I don't know, she whispered. They must have been lost when everything happened. But a memory was stirring. A small, locked chest her husband had always kept hidden. The in-laws had taken it. Suddenly the fight wasn't just about protecting the children. It was about finding the truth. It was about justice. But Thorn was a patient man. He didn't send his thugs. He sent something far more insidious. He sent the town. The whispers started again. But this time they had a sharper, more dangerous edge. They said Lorenzo was holding Elsie against her will. They said he was a violent man, a madman, a danger to the community. They said he was after her husband's money. The poison worked. Neighbors who had once nodded in greeting now turned their backs. The storekeeper refused to sell them supplies. The preacher spoke from the pulpit about the dangers of inviting darkness into your home. They were being isolated, starved out, and then, one morning, James, the little boy, fell ill. A fever that came on fast and burned hot. Lorenzo rode for the doctor, but the doctor was out on a call. He wouldn't be back for days. As Elsie bathed her son's burning forehead, she knew. This was Thorn's work. A sickness that couldn't be traced. A warning that was also a death sentence. She was alone, trapped, her child dying in her arms. And the man who had become her rock was miles away, seeking help that would never come. The world had abandoned her. Again. And this time, she was afraid it would be for the last time. The fever raged. Little James tossed and turned, his small body slick with sweat. Elsie's prayers were a desperate, frantic murmur in the quiet, suffocating cabin. She was alone. Completely alone. Lorenzo was gone, seeking a doctor who would never come, and the town had turned its back on her. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the prairie, a new sound reached her ears. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several. They were coming. Thorn's men. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She ran to the door and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. She grabbed Lorenzo's rifle from its pegs on the wall. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold it. "Who's in there?" a man's voice called from outside. It wasn't one of Thorn's thugs. It was the sheriff. "Sheriff, please!" Elsie cried out. "My boy is sick. They've poisoned him." There was a long pause. Then the sheriff's voice, hard and official. "Open the door, Elsie. Jasper Thorn just wants to talk." They were in it together. The law was just another one of Thorn's weapons. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. The first heavy thud hit the door, making the whole cabin shake. They were trying to break it down. She scrambled to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The yard was full of them. The sheriff, his deputies, and a half-dozen of Thorn's hired guns. And sitting on a fine black horse, watching it all with a calm reptilian smile, was Jasper Thorn himself. Another crash against the door. A splinter of wood flew past her face. It was over. They were going to kill her. They were going to take her children. And then, another sound. A single, sharp crack of a rifle from the ridge behind the cabin. One of Thorn's men crumpled to the ground. Lorenzo. He had come back. The yard exploded into chaos. Thorn's men scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the trees. But Lorenzo was a ghost, a shadow moving through the rocks and pines, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. The sheriff and his deputies, their courage gone, turned and fled. Thorn, his face a mask of rage, tried to rally his men, but they were dropping one by one. He spurred his horse, galloping straight for the cabin. He was going to burn her out. Elsie raised the rifle. Her father had taught her to shoot, a lifetime ago. Her hands were still shaking, but her eye was steady. She took a deep breath, just like he had shown her. She aimed, and she fired. The bullet caught Thorn's horse in the chest. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Thorn into the dirt just feet from the porch. He scrambled to his feet, his fine suit covered in mud, and drew his pistol. The cabin door flew open. Elsie stood there, the rifle still in her hands, her face a mask of cold fury. At the same time, Lorenzo stepped out of the trees, his own rifle leveled at Thorn's heart. He was trapped. "It's over, Thorn," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet. Thorn just laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. He swung his pistol, not at Lorenzo, but at Elsie. But before he could fire, another figure appeared. Ida, her small face grim, stood in the doorway behind her mother, holding Lorenzo's heavy hunting knife in both hands. With a cry that was pure rage, she threw it. The blade spun through the air, catching Thorn in the shoulder. He screamed, his pistol firing harmlessly into the sky as he staggered back. The fight was over. The townsfolk, drawn by the sound of gunfire, began to appear at the edge of the ranch. They saw Thorn, wounded and defeated. They saw the sheriff's abandoned posse. They saw Elsie, standing tall, a rifle in her hand. And they saw Lorenzo, walking toward her, his eyes full of a love so powerful it was a physical thing. The truth, in the end, didn't need ledgers or papers. It just needed a brave woman and a good man to stand together and fight for it. The in-laws were exposed as Thorn's pawns and driven from the valley in disgrace. The locked chest was found, and the ledgers inside were enough to send Thorn to a federal prison for the rest of his life. With the valley freed from his tyranny, the townsfolk, shamed and grateful, rallied around their new heroes. They helped rebuild what was broken, offering food, labor, and, for the first time, their genuine respect. Lorenzo and Elsie were married by the preacher, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. The whole town came, their cheers echoing through the valley. They stood on the porch of their home, their children between them, and watched the sun set over the land that was finally, truly theirs. The ghosts of the past were gone, replaced by the promise of a future they would build together. If this story of courage and redemption moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the Wild West. And let us know in the comments below, what do you think makes a family? Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for the truth.